Hi, automotive enthusiasts. Welcome to Overdrive Insider, where today we dive into the origin story of one of the most important machines in modern motorcycling, the 1994 Triumph Speed Triple. This wasn't just another motorcycle rolling off an assembly line. It was a bold declaration, a comeback statement, and a spark that ignited an entire segment of two-wheeled culture. To appreciate it fully, we need to rewind the clock and see Triumph not as the global powerhouse we know today, but as a company clawing its way back from collapse. After years of decline and even bankruptcy, Triumph's survival in the late 20th century was far from guaranteed. The Speed Triple wasn't just a product launch, it was a pivot point, a motorcycle that would embody risk, rebellion, and the raw appeal of speed stripped down to its essentials. When the Speed Triple appeared, it looked nothing like the machines dominating the early 1990s sport bike market. Japanese manufacturers were perfecting aerodynamic superbikes that looked like they belonged on racetracks, shrouded in layers of plastic fairings and tuned for high-performance precision. Triumph made the radical choice to go in the opposite direction. They gave riders a naked machine, bare and aggressive, powered by a 3-cylinder engine that carried echoes of the brand's heritage, but aimed squarely at the future. The decision wasn't only technical, it was cultural. It was about connecting with riders who wanted authenticity, who wanted a machine that felt as dangerous as it looked, and who wanted to make a statement every time they rolled into town. For viewers today, this story matters because the Speed Triple marked the beginning of factory-built Streetfighters. Before this, the style existed only in back alleys and custom garages, where riders crashed their sport bikes or stripped them down for attitude over elegance. Triumph seized that underground spirit and legitimized it on the showroom floor. The gamble was huge. If riders didn't buy into the idea, Triumph's fragile resurgence could have stumbled, maybe even collapsed again. But if it worked, the brand would find its identity and help create an entirely new class of motorcycles. Over the course of this video, we'll trace how Triumph dared to take that gamble, how the Speed Triple came to life as both a cultural provocation and a technical experiment, and how its impact still reverberates decades later. We'll break down the struggles, the breakthroughs, and the legacy of this naked street fighter, showing why a machine launched in 1994 still matters today. By the end, you'll see not just a motorcycle, but a moment in history when a company and a culture collided to change the direction of motorcycling forever. So settle in, because the story of the 1994 Triumph Speed Triple is one of risk, rebellion, and rebirth, and it begins right now. Triumph's resurrection in the early 1990s was anything but guaranteed, and the Speed Triple would become the motorcycle that either validated or doomed the company's daring approach. To understand how it emerged, we need to look at the crossroads Triumph faced after years of absence from the global stage. The reborn brand under John Bloor had invested heavily in new manufacturing techniques and a fresh range of models, but none had yet broken through as the defining statement of the new Triumph. The market was crowded with Japanese heavyweights and European challengers, each carving out niches with precision engineering and aggressive pricing. Triumph needed not just competence, but distinction. Into that pressure cooker came the idea of a stripped-down, aggressive street machine, something that wasn't just about riding, but about attitude. Microstory, the garage-born movement. In cities across the UK and Europe, young riders were already creating their own stripped-down motorcycles. They took crashed sport bikes or unwanted older machines, tore off the fairings, and rode them raw. These bikes looked menacing, with exposed engines and upright stances, and they carried an edge that said rebellion more than refinement. They weren't polished showpieces. They were built for the thrill of speed without pretense. Triumph's leadership saw this movement gaining momentum and asked a bold question. What if a factory could capture that same spirit, but with durability, quality, and legitimacy? That idea would become the Speed Triple. Context digest. Market conditions in the early 90s. At the time, sport bikes were climbing in both horsepower and aerodynamic design, and nearly every manufacturer believed sleek, faired machines were the future. Riders who wanted something different had no official outlet. They built it themselves. Triumph realized it could differentiate itself by not competing head-on with the Japanese titans, but by addressing the overlooked desire for a factory-made machine that looked like it belonged on the streets rather than a racetrack. This was a radical positioning strategy for a company just getting back on its feet. Microstory. The choice of the triple engine. Triumph's identity had always been tied to its parallel twins, but the new company sought a distinctive edge. The three-cylinder engine became their calling card, smooth, characterful, and different from both the screaming inline-fours of Japan and the booming V-twins of Italy. For the Speed Triple, they lifted the Daytona 900's triple, tuned it for torque and flexibility, and gave it a naked chassis that put the motor front and center. Riders felt its unique rhythm immediately. It was neither racer clinical nor cruiser lazy. It was something else, raw but usable, balanced but unruly in the right hands. Reflection bridge. This choice of engine didn't just power the Speed Triple. It anchored Triumph's modern identity. The Triple became shorthand for the brand's difference. Micro-story. Styling as a statement. When the Speed Triple appeared in showrooms, it shocked even seasoned riders. It had an upright riding position, a single-round headlight, muscular tank, and stripped bodywork that revealed mechanical honesty. Where rivals chased futuristic lines, Triumph offered industrial minimalism. It wasn't flashy in the way of Italian exotica, but it radiated purpose. For a generation raised on polished Japanese superbikes, this looked raw, maybe even unfinished. Yet for others, it was precisely what made it irresistible. Triumph was essentially telling riders, this is what a motorcycle looks like when you peel back the layers. Context digest, reaction of the press and riders. Early reviews were polarized. Some critics praised the Speed Triple for daring to be different and for its intoxicating three-cylinder power delivery. Others complained it looked like a project bike rather than a polished factory model, but that tension worked in Triumph's favor. By sparking debate, the Speed Triple became more than a product. It became a conversation piece, a cultural marker. Riders who bought one weren't just choosing a bike, they were choosing a side in an evolving definition of what motorcycling could be. Micro-story. A factory Streetfighter takes hold. The term Streetfighter had been underground slang for years, referring to those garage-built bruisers stripped of excess. Triumph elevated that term into a showroom option. Suddenly, riders who admired the aesthetic but lacked the skills or inclination to build one themselves could walk into a dealership and buy a brand new machine with that raw DNA baked in. This was revolutionary. For the first time, a major manufacturer embraced a style born of rebellion rather than refinement, making the subculture mainstream without killing its attitude. Reflection bridge. This moment marked a shift. The underground had gone overground, and Triumph was steering the cultural wave rather than chasing it. Context digest. Why it mattered beyond sales. For Triumph, the Speed Triple was more than units moved. It established a brand identity that no other manufacturer had claimed, and it put Triumph back into conversations not just as a survivor, but as a leader. That mattered because the motorcycle market isn't only about performance numbers, it's about identity, passion, and belonging. By claiming the Streetfighter mantle, Triumph staked a territory that couldn't easily be replicated by its competitors. Micro-story. The racing gambit. Triumph didn't stop at styling. They leaned into competition. The Speed Triple Challenge, a one-make racing series, launched in the UK and brought attention to the new model. Riders lined up to thrash identical machines on track, showcasing durability and performance in the roughest of conditions. This grassroots competition wasn't just about trophies. It was about visibility. It showed riders worldwide that the Speed Triple wasn't a gimmick, but a platform built to perform, even under punishment. Micro-story. The emotional buy-in. For owners, the Speed Triple was more than transportation. It carried the cachet of rebellion with the reassurance of factory support. Riders who bought one weren't just purchasing a motorcycle, they were making a statement about who they were. Anecdotes quickly spread of Speed Triple riders forming tight-knit groups, treating their bikes as badges of identity. That emotional hook is what transformed the model from novelty to icon. Micro-story. Tension between heritage and innovation. While the Speed Triple was a bold step forward, it also carried subtle callbacks to Triumph's past. The stripped-down design echoed cafe racers from the 1960s, and the muscular stance felt like a modern interpretation of classic British roadsters. This allowed Triumph to bridge its heritage with its rebirth, satisfying loyalists who craved continuity while exciting younger riders who wanted something fresh. That duality gave the Speed Triple a rare cultural resonance. Micro-story. The weight of risk. Inside Triumph, the decision to greenlight the Speed Triple was far from universally accepted. Some feared it was too niche, too risky for a brand still fragile after bankruptcy. Betting on an unproven style could have left the company vulnerable to failure. But Bloor and his team recognized that survival without distinction was no survival at all. The Speed Triple was risky, yes, but it was the kind of risk that defined whether Triumph could thrive or fade into irrelevance. Micro story, global reception. In the UK, the Speed Triple immediately resonated, feeding off the local Streetfighter culture. In the US, adoption was slower, as the market was dominated by big cruisers and Japanese superbikes. But gradually, word spread of this unusual British machine that felt different from anything else on the road. Continental Europe, especially Germany, also embraced it, and soon the Speed Triple was carving a reputation as an outsider's choice, appealing to riders who resisted conformity. Micro story, building a cult. Following. What made the Speed Triple special was not just what it was, but what it symbolized. It attracted riders who didn't want to blend in, who saw themselves as part of a counterculture within motorcycling. Clubs, gatherings, and customizations followed, amplifying its cultural footprint. Triumph had succeeded in sparking not just sales, but a movement. Micro story. Commercial outcome. By the end of its initial run, the Speed Triple had sold well enough to cement its place in Triumph's lineup. More importantly, it established a foundation for future iterations, each refining and evolving the formula without losing the original's raw DNA. The gamble had paid off. The journey of the Speed Triple's birth and early impact sets the stage for the next development. How this one model didn't just revive Triumph's fortunes, but also reshaped the global motorcycle market, forcing rivals to respond and permanently altering the landscape of two-wheeled culture. As the Speed Triple found its footing, Triumph quickly realized it had done more than launch a successful motorcycle. It had created a template that the entire industry would have to reckon with. What began as a bold gamble to stand out against Japanese superbikes now evolved into a defining narrative of how naked performance bikes could exist as a factory segment. The mid-1990s motorcycle world was in flux, with manufacturers trying to predict the next big trend. The Speed Triple showed that rebellion could be commercialized without losing its sting, and that set off ripples far beyond Hinckley. Micro story, competitors take notice. Ducati, long admired for its exotic V-twins, had already dabbled with naked machines in the form of the Monster. But the Speed Triple's arrival sharpened the idea that this was no passing fad. Yamaha, Suzuki, and Honda would follow with their own stripped-down, muscular bikes, realizing that Triumph had given legitimacy to what was once garage culture. Suddenly, every showroom needed a naked bruiser. The Speed Triple had changed the game by proving there was a market for authenticity packaged with factory reliability. Context digest. Differentiation becomes identity. For Triumph, this wasn't just about keeping pace. It was about solidifying a unique identity in a crowded field. By the late 1990s, riders didn't just associate Triumph with heritage. They associated it with the triple engine and the attitude of the Speed Triple. This created a narrative hook that was far stronger than just performance stats. It made Triumph a brand you bought into for philosophy as much as horsepower. Micro story, the evolution of the formula. Triumph didn't let the Speed Triple stagnate. As the model gained traction, each update sharpened its role. Displacements grew, styling became more aggressive, and technology caught up with rising expectations. Yet through it all, the core DNA remained. Muscular stance, exposed engine, and that distinctive three-cylinder heart. Where rivals often softened their naked bikes into more practical all-rounders, Triumph doubled down on attitude. It was a bet that their riders didn't want compromise, they wanted presence. Reflection bridge. The Speed Triple was no longer just a product. It was a manifesto in steel and fuel. Micro story, racing. As validation, the Speed Triple Challenge Racing Series became a touchstone, with riders hurling identical machines into battle across UK tracks. The sight of stripped-down Triumphs dicing wheel-to-wheel thrilled fans and built credibility. This wasn't marketing fluff. It was real performance showcased in unforgiving conditions. For Triumph, this exposure mattered, proving the Speed Triple wasn't just a fashion statement, but a machine that could take abuse and still deliver. Context digest, the broader cultural shift. The 1990s saw a growing skepticism of corporate polish, mirrored in music, fashion, and even motorcycles. The stripped-down look resonated with a generation disenchanted with excess. Just as grunge rejected glam rock, the Speed Triple and its peers rejected plastic-wrapped superbikes. Riders found authenticity in exposed frames, visible welds, and unhidden mechanicals. Triumph's timing couldn't have been better. They weren't just selling a motorcycle, they were aligning with an attitude. Microstory, the American challenge. In the US, where Harley-Davidson cruisers reigned and Japanese sport bikes dominated youth culture, the Speed Triple carved out a niche as the outsider's machine. American riders who bought one were making a clear statement. They didn't want to follow the mainstream paths. Triumph leveraged this with careful marketing, framing the Speed Triple not as a competitor to cruisers or sport bikes, but as its own category. That distinction helped it avoid direct competition while building a cult-like following. Microstory. Engineering evolutions. As emissions laws tightened and performance expectations rose, Triumph refined the Speed Triple's internals. Fuel injection replaced carburetors, frames grew stiffer, and suspension more sophisticated. Yet the engineers carefully preserved the visceral character of the triple engine. Riders praised how each generation felt familiar yet improved, a rare balance of continuity and progress. The result was loyalty. Owners felt their machine aged gracefully rather than being replaced by something alien. Reflection bridge. With each evolution, the Speed Triple proved it wasn't a one-hit wonder, but a platform with staying power. Microstory. Rivalry with the Ducati Monster. While both the Ducati Monster and Triumph Speed Triple defined the naked segment, their personalities diverged. The Monster leaned on Italian flair and compact design, while the Speed Triple embraced bulk, aggression, and torque-rich character. This rivalry fueled debates in riding circles worldwide. Which was the true naked icon? The arguments only amplified the Speed Triple's visibility, as riders defended their choice with passion that transcended specs. Context digest. Influence on motorcycle design. Beyond naked bikes, the Speed Triple's ethos bled into broader motorcycle design. Sport touring machines began shedding weight and fairings, adventure bikes embraced rugged functional aesthetics, and even Japanese manufacturers experimented with more aggressive stances. Triumph had set a tone. Motorcycles didn't need to be smooth and glossy to succeed. They could be raw, unapologetic, and desirable. Microstory. Owner stories that built. Myth. Tales circulated of Speed Triples clocking high miles without complaint, of being customized into even wilder shapes, of standing out at every meet. Owners proudly retold how strangers would stop them at gas stations to ask what they were riding. These stories created folklore, a narrative ecosystem where each individual machine contributed to a larger myth. Triumph couldn't have paid for better marketing. Microstory. The rise of the twin headlights. One of the most polarizing design evolutions came when Triumph added twin headlights to the Speed Triple. At first derided as bug-eyed or cartoonish, they eventually became synonymous with the model's identity. The twin lamps turned what might have been a conventional update into an instantly recognizable face. Love them or hate them, you knew a Speed Triple when it appeared in your mirrors. That recognition power became branding gold. Microstory, balancing performance with usability. Unlike some rivals that sacrificed comfort for aggression, the Speed Triple found a middle ground. Riders discovered it was comfortable enough for commuting and touring, yet wild enough for canyon carving. This duality expanded its appeal, making it not just a weekend toy but a real-world partner. Triumph's decision to keep ergonomics practical, without softening the attitude, paid dividends in long-term popularity. Microstory. Cementing legacy. In the 2000s. By the turn of the millennium, the Speed Triple had established itself as more than a curiosity. Each iteration improved power, handling, and reliability, and Triumph's reputation had grown alongside it. The model became a core pillar of the lineup, trusted to carry both heritage and innovation forward. What started as a gamble in 1994 had become a cornerstone of the brand. As the story of the Speed Triple's escalation shows, it wasn't just Triumph that changed. The motorcycle landscape itself shifted. What remained to be seen was how this legacy would echo into the modern era, shaping perceptions of motorcycling and defining what riders expected from naked machines in the decades that followed. By the time the new millennium settled in, the Speed Triple was no longer just Triumph's daring gamble. It had become the bike that defined the brand's future and influenced the entire naked motorcycle class. What began in 1994 as a stripped-down experiment had matured into a symbol of modern motorcycling. raw yet refined, rebellious yet reliable. The question was no longer whether Triumph would survive, but how the Speed Triple's DNA would ripple forward into design, culture, and rider expectations. Microstory: the Streetfighter becomes mainstream. What started as an underground aesthetic had by the 2000s become an accepted category. Triumph's Speed Triple stood shoulder to shoulder with Ducati's Monster, Aprilia's Tuono, and Japanese entrants like the Yamaha FZ1 and Suzuki Bandit. Yet where others adapted existing models, Triumph's identity was inseparable from its naked flagship. For many riders, the Speed Triple wasn't just an option, it was the definition of what a naked bike should be. Context Digest: influence on Triumph's lineup. The Speed Triple's success gave Triumph the confidence to expand. The smaller Street Triple would arrive, aimed at riders who wanted the same DNA in a lighter, more accessible package. Adventure bikes like the Tiger family carried echoes of the naked aggression in their styling and stance. Even Triumph's fully fared models leaned on the reputation earned by the Speed Triple. In this way, one motorcycle's character bled into an entire company's trajectory. Microstory: the power of recognition. By the late 2000s, the bug-eyed twin headlights had become iconic. Even riders who had never owned a Triumph could spot a Speed Triple instantly. It wasn't just a design quirk. It was a cultural signal. Riders began associating those headlights with a certain kind of motorcyclist, someone who valued authenticity, performance, and individuality. In advertising terms, Triumph had achieved what few brands ever manage, turning a design choice into an identity marker. Reflection Bridge. The Speed Triple was no longer just a model. It was a symbol that carried meaning beyond its spec sheet. Microstory: owner communities expand. Across Europe, North America, and Asia, owner groups multiplied. Online forums buzzed with modification tips, road trip stories, and debates about the best year of the Speed Triple. These communities weren't just sharing information, they were reinforcing a sense of belonging tied directly to their machines. The Speed Triple wasn't merely a purchase, it was a passport into a tribe. That sense of camaraderie amplified loyalty and made each new generation feel like an evolution shared by all. Context Digest: cultural alignment. Beyond motorcycling, the Speed Triple mirrored cultural tastes that valued transparency and grit. Music, fashion, and even film were shifting toward unfiltered expression. The Speed Triple's raw aesthetic fit neatly into this cultural moment, making it not just a product of motorcycling trends, but of broader lifestyle currents. It wasn't designed to be fashionable, yet it became fashionable precisely because it was unapologetically authentic. Microstory: the legacy of performance. Each new Speed Triple generation brought more horsepower, better suspension, and refined electronics, but the core experience remained visceral. Riders described the acceleration as addictive, the handling as balance between aggression and confidence. The Speed Triple proved that a motorcycle didn't need to be cloaked in aerodynamic plastic to thrill. It offered a different kind of performance, one that felt unfiltered, closer to the mechanical heartbeat. That unique thrill became its enduring legacy. Microstory: global recognition. By the 2010s, Triumph had become a global player again, and the Speed Triple was a major reason why. It gave the brand credibility in Europe, cachet in the US, and allure in Asia. Riders around the world saw it as a legitimate alternative to both Japanese efficiency and Italian flair. Its reputation carried weight far beyond sales figures. It made Triumph aspirational again. Reflection Bridge. The gamble taken in 1994 had blossomed into a long-term win, reshaping Triumph's destiny and the wider motorcycling world. Microstory: rivals adapt again. As the naked class matured, manufacturers leaned harder into performance. Some bikes leaned track-focused, others commuter-friendly. Yet Triumph kept threading the needle, ensuring the Speed Triple remained both accessible and formidable. Rivals had to continuously react to its balance of usability and aggression. This ongoing tension meant the Speed Triple wasn't just a product in a lineup, it was a benchmark. Context Digest: defining naked bikes. Today, look at any showroom today and you'll find naked bikes with aggressive stances, minimal fairings, and muscular engines. That wasn't inevitable. It was shaped by the choices Triumph made with the Speed Triple and the cultural validation that followed. What riders expect from a naked bike, authenticity, presence, and performance, was crystallized by the Speed Triple's decades-long influence. Micro story. The emotional through line. Ask Speed Triple owners why they chose it, and their answers often go beyond performance. They talk about character, about how the bike feels alive, about how it reflects their identity. That emotional resonance is rare in the world of vehicles, and it explains why the model has endured while so many others fade. The Speed Triple didn't just meet needs, it connected to values. Micro story. A legacy written in steel. More than 25 years after its debut, the Speed Triple stands as proof that risk can yield longevity. What started as a desperate bid for survival became the foundation of a global resurgence. Triumph today is thriving, respected, and innovative, and none of that would have been possible without the Speed Triple carving out an identity when the brand most needed one. As the story comes full circle, the Speed Triple's impact isn't confined to Triumph's fortunes or even motorcycling's design language. It reshaped what riders expect from authenticity, what manufacturers risk in pursuit of identity, and how culture and machinery intertwine. Its legacy endures not just in the latest models on the road, but in the very definition of what a naked Streetfighter means. The story of the Triumph Speed Triple is more than the tale of a motorcycle. It's the journey of a company rediscovering its soul and a culture redefining what authenticity means on two wheels. From its debut in 1994, the Speed Triple embodied rawness, rebellion, and rebirth. It wasn't the fastest bike of its era, nor the most polished, but it carried a spark that electrified riders who wanted something different. That spark became a flame that spread through Triumph's lineup, through rival manufacturers, and across global motorcycling culture. The Speed Triple wasn't just a machine. It was a mirror reflecting the desires of a generation that craved honesty in design and spirit in performance. Looking back, it's clear that Triumph's gamble paid off. The Speed Triple created an identity for a company struggling to stand out, and it provided riders with a motorcycle that felt alive in ways others did not. It turned the concept of the Streetfighter from an underground garage movement into a global factory standard. In doing so, it reshaped what riders expect when they choose a naked bike: attitude, character, and presence alongside power. Its legacy is visible today in every brand's naked lineup, but the original Speed Triple still holds a unique place as the pioneer that set the tone. For riders, the lesson of the Speed Triple is that motorcycles are never just about engineering specs. They are about identity, belonging, and the courage of manufacturers to take risks that align with cultural undercurrents. Triumph's willingness to strip back the layers and expose both machine and philosophy created not just a product, but a legacy. That's why, decades later, the Speed Triple is still revered, not only as a motorcycle that saved a company, but as one that helped redefine an entire class. So, as we close this story, remember that the Speed Triple was born in a moment of uncertainty, yet it forged a future filled with confidence and influence. It stands today as a testament to the power of risk, the importance of identity, and the enduring appeal of motorcycles that wear their hearts on their sleeves. Thanks for riding with us on Overdrive Insider. See you next time, automotive enthusiasts.